After having presented the greetings and welcome from the officials who just spoke, all of them very flatteringly, and I'm very grateful to all of them for what they said and for the very fact that they're in attendance here. Now we move, shall I say, to the more academic aspect of our program. And I'd like to say a word or two about that before our speakers begin. And I'm being quite sincere with you. I've gone to a great many conferences, and I've arranged a great many conferences, and I always appear optimistic and pleased and looking forward to it. But most of them are boring beyond belief. But today, when I see who's going to speak and what they're going to speak about, I'm genuinely interested. I want to hear each one of those. And I've heard, I think, all of the speakers today, and you will enjoy them, you will profit from them, and will be the better for them. Our first speaker is Professor Robert Szymczak from a branch of the Pennsylvania State University. Robert and I have been friends for a great many years, and he is one of those very rare people who holds not one but two doctorates, and has in his career published a great deal, some of it award-winning. And he writes mostly about Poles in America and their relationship to things Polish. He writes beautifully, charmingly, impressively, and engagingly. And he also speaks well, but please remember, he speaks much too long. So if he goes more than, let's say, 7 or 8 minutes, just leave, because it'll be boring for all of us. So, having said that, it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Szymczak, who will be discussing this morning Polonia and the Holler Army. Bob?
Thank you, Professor Biskupski, and good morning to all. And my talk today won't be too long, and it's about Polonia and General Józef Haller. We'll start first with the American side of things and see how the nexus is created between Polonia and Józef Haller. So if we start with the beginning, the creation of a Polish army during World War I to fight for the resurrection of an independent Poland was complicated. The homeland was partitioned among 3 empires since the late 18th century: the Germans in the west, the Russians in the central and eastern provinces, the Austro-Hungarians in the southern and southeastern lands. And Poles from these 3 territories were drafted into the armies of all 3 in World War I. And yes, there were bloody engagements between the Germans and Austrians on one side and the Imperial Russians on the other, where Poles faced their own countrymen wearing the enemy's uniform. If we look at the American side of this, on how this is going to come together, between 1870 and 1914, about 3.6 million Poles left their partitioned homeland, and among them was a 9-year-old boy named Teofil Starzyński. He was from Osowiec in German-ruled Western Poland. And he joined his 3 older brothers here with and an older sister and his mother in 1887, and they all came to Pittsburgh. Starzyński learned English in a Catholic school and worked at a Polish pharmacy in Pittsburgh on the south side. And his employer had been a member of the original Polish Sokół organization in the old country, and he influenced young Starzyński to help to found this physical education group's first Falcon's Nest, as they call it, in Pittsburgh, and that happened in 1897. Starzyński became the first Pittsburgh Pole, actually, to become a physician graduating from the Western University of Pennsylvania, known now as the University of Pittsburgh. And that was in 1904. Well, he was actually the first Polish student ever to be awarded a medical degree in Pittsburgh, period. In 1912, Starzyński was elected president of the Polish Falcons of America. Pittsburgh became the national headquarters of the organization and remains so to this day. Now, Dr. Starzyński was always interested in the problem of Poland's resurrection as a sovereign state. He was acutely aware, though, that undoing the partitions of the 18th century would be a most Herculean task indeed. But he hoped it might be possible in the context of a general European war. Should such a situation arise, well, the Polish Falcons must be ready to make a military contribution somehow toward this cherished goal if the circumstances warranted such an action. So the Falcons, if you compare them to all the other major Polish organizations in the United States, was relatively small compared to, for example, the Polish National Alliance. But with Starzyński at the helm, they had some clout. Now, if you take a look at this closer, you'll see that the membership of the Falcons was not more than 20,000 at this time. 20,000. So Starzyński knew that they couldn't do it by themselves. To help Poland, all American Polonia would have to contribute to this cause. And President Woodrow Wilson's support was absolutely essential. So in November 1913, Starzyński visited the White House at the head of a Falcons delegation to apprise the president of the Falcon effort to train volunteers for military service on Poland's behalf if and when the opportunity should arise. Now, when American troops were dispatched to Tampico and Veracruz, Mexico, in the spring of 1914. We had a flap with Mexico over the Veracruz episode. Starzyński actually proposed the deployment of several hundred newly trained Falcons, a kind of Polish-American National Guard, he said. He wanted them to serve in the occupation, an offer that the War Department promptly but politely declined. The beginning of the Great War in August 1914 found organized Polonia in a quandary over what course of action would best advance the Polish cause. With two of Poland's partitioners engaged in a war against a third, Russia, the homeland became a battleground on the Eastern Front. In view of American neutrality in this war, that's what really made the raising and training of a Polish-American army impossible in the United States as long as this country was neutral. Now, Starzyński actually distanced the Falcons from those other Polish organizations who advocated action in favor of one side or the other. And he adopted a position of stand ready and wait. And he said that was the only realistic option at the time. So the Falcons joined the newly formed Central Polish Relief Committee in the fall of 1914. And that organization was linked to the conservative leadership of the Polish National Council, called the Rada Narodowa, and also links it with the large Polish National Alliance and a host of smaller organizations, and it created a federation of over 90% of organized Polonia. Soon thereafter, the Rada, as it was called, the Rada Narodowa, established connections with the Swiss-based Polish Victims Relief Fund, chaired by the Nobel laureate Henryk Sienkiewicz, a close associate of the celebrated pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski. In December 1914, Starzyński and a Falcons delegation presented an eloquent statement justifying the case for Polish independence to President Wilson, who was said to have reacted sympathetically. During the following year, the Polish Central Relief Committee formed the National Department, the Wydział Narodowy, as its political arm, which in due course would establish the Polish Military Commission with Starzyński in effect as the chief recruiter of a Polish-American military force. Now, an important first step was taken in late 1916 when the Falcons negotiated an agreement with the Canadian authorities for training of Poles resident in the United States, thus circumventing American neutrality restrictions. Send them to Canada, have them trained there. So as the United States edged closer to the war, closer to war during the early months of 1917, Starzyński scheduled an extraordinary Falcon meeting to discuss plans for the recruitment of a Polish-American army. As fate would have it, on the second day of this meeting in Pittsburgh, April 2nd, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on the Central Powers. That making the most of this momentous coincidence, the Falcons president contacted Paderewski, then in Washington as the representative of Roman Dmowski's Polish National Committee, and persuaded the maestro to address the Falcons Convention in Pittsburgh to boost the idea of a Polish military contribution to the Allied cause, and hopefully the resurrection of an independent Poland. So Paderewski jumped on a train and hurried to Pittsburgh and delivered the message to the Falcons at this convention. And we have to remember that it was Paderewski more than anybody else who had influenced and charmed both Wilson and his advisor, Edward M. House, on this Polish issue. Moreover, the renowned pianist and composer had given so many concerts across the United States to raise funds for Polish war relief that he became unquestionably the personification of Polish aspirations for many Americans as well as the immigrants from his homeland. Paderewski's appearance in Pittsburgh at the Falcons meeting electrified the audience, as did his proposal that Starzyński's organization, the Falcons, should lead an effort to recruit a 100,000-strong Kościuszko army, as he called it, to fight alongside American forces on the Western Front. Nevertheless, no actual recruitment could actually begin until the War Department worked out its own plans for a large U.S. expeditionary force to be sent overseas. In early June 1917, the French government offered to sponsor the creation of a Polish army in France comprised of Poles living in Western Europe, prisoners of war captured by the French from the German forces on the Western Front, and immigrant Poles from the United States. By September 1917, Washington finally agreed to the formation of a Polish-American force to be sent to France as part of a French-commanded Polish army after training at Niagara-on-the-Lake in Ontario, Canada. The fact that Dmowski's Polish National Committee, by then ensconced in Paris, was included in these negotiations underscored the willingness of the Western allies to deal with that entity as an official Polish organization. We should also remember that prior to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March of 1917, the French had regarded the sensitive Polish issue as an internal Russian issue, not really theirs. But that has changed after the Russian collapse and the Tsar is gone. Now, when the Russian provisional government declared its support for an independent Poland and permitted the organization of separate Polish military units in Russia, it also agreed to a Polish army in France to fight on the Western Front. So now Russia's on board with the new government, and they're still on the Allied side. And they okayed this. Starzyński and his colleagues, working under the aegis of the Wydział Narodowy, officially began to recruit Polish-American volunteers in mid-October, establishing 47 enlistment centers. Now, the War Department in Washington, however, had imposed certain restrictions on this whole process. No American citizen of Polish origin or any Polish-born resident who had already applied for U.S. citizenship could be enlisted. Poles with dependent families were also off-limits, totally, to Starzyński's recruiters, as were all those born within the Hohenzollern and Habsburg domains of the partitioned lands of Poland. Why? Because if they were captured, the fear was they would be executed by the Central Powers as traitors to those empires. Now, thus, the base of, of potential enlistees was reduced to only non-U.S. citizens born in the Russian provinces of the homeland. Although these rules, I must tell you, were broken in a number of, on a number of occasions. Nevertheless, that was what the guidelines were for Starzyński and his other recruiters trying to build this army. Well, as expected, the initial wave of volunteers came from the Polish Falcons. Overall, though, some 38,000 men from 18 states and 3 different Canadian provinces applied for enlistment. Now, after screening and training, almost 22,000 ultimately made it to France, and the first 3,000 of them arrived before the end of 1917 on the Western Front. Placed under French command, the Polish-American troops joined other Polish units that were already attached to the French army. These units will see action in the last part of the war, the last months of World War I, a string of operations and assaults. Now, in early October 1918, 5 weeks before the armistice, General Józef Haller was appointed commander-in-chief of this Polish army in France. At that point, the combined Polish forces had 6 divisions, and they were officially recognized by France, Great Britain, and Italy as an autonomous and co-belligerent army under the political authority of Roman Dmowski's Polish National Committee in Paris. So the United States followed suit a month later in recognizing this organization. Józef Haller was born in Jurczyce in the Austrian portion of the Polish partitions in 1873. From 1895 to 1906, no, not 1906, sorry, 1895 to 1906, he served in the Austrian army and resigned after reaching the rank of captain. He supported the paramilitary pro-independence Polish organization, Sokół, and in 1916 he became the commander of the 2nd Brigade of the Polish Legion. Famous, 1st Polish Legion was commanded by Józef Pilsudski. The 2nd Brigade was commanded by Haller as of 1916. So Haller's, in 1918, Haller's troops broke through the Austro-Russian front lines to the Ukraine, where he linked up with Polish troops who deserted from the Tsarist army. In 1918, he protested the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that pulls Russia out of the war completely, and continued to battle the Russians with the 2nd Brigade of the Polish legions. Now, a fierce battle followed with the Germans, who regarded the presence of Polish troops in Ukraine as illegal. So this was the Battle of Kaniów, May 10th, 1918, with 2,500 casualties and the internment of his troops, although Haller managed to escape. Anyway, by way of Murmansk, he arrived in France in July 1918, and his next assignment will be, of course, the commander-in-chief of the what we call the Haller Army, the Polish army in France, also known as the Blue Army, because they were totally outfitted in French uniforms, which were sky blue. Why? Because the French General Staff, after World War I began, decided that with trench warfare and fighting on the open fields, it would be harder for the Germans to shoot at the French if they're wearing the brown uniforms they had worn before. So if you make the uniform sky blue, maybe these guys will blend in with the sky somewhat and be more difficult to hit. And so that was the justification. Nevertheless, the whole French army was attired in blue uniforms, and those are the uniforms that were given to Haller's force in France, hence the Blue Army. So now, after the fighting stopped in France, the armistice came, the Blue Army, Haller's troops, were dispatched to Poland. And there they fought in Ukraine against Ukrainian nationalist forces. And in 1920, Haller's army will now be in Pomerania and entered Danzig, Gdańsk today. And he actually performed a marriage ceremony linking the Baltic Sea once again with the Republic of Poland. So it was a stirring ceremony where they threw a wreath into the water, and Haller, there's a picture of him on his horse, marrying once again the Baltic to resurrected Poland. And many of his men saw this, and they talked about it for years afterwards. In 1920, Haller's army seized all of Pomerania and entered, at that time, fighting the Germans and people who just tried to stop the Poles from taking the corridor area of Poland at that time. He also commanded a force which included Blue Army troops against the Soviets, and he will take part in the Russo-Polish War 1920 with those troops. Now, I must tell you that while his men were in Poland and Ukraine, there were reports of anti-Jewish violence. Now, Haller punished a number of troops who looted Jewish shops and such. We know he did that. But some of these episodes were later proven to be false, but others turned out to be, unfortunately, true. Nevertheless, I had to mention to you that there were some reports of anti-Jewish violence, and Henry Morgenthau led a commission sent from the United States to look into some of these atrocities, whether they were alleged or actually real. He was given a list of Ukrainian towns that allegedly saw violence committed by Blue Army troops. They studied the list, they went to all these places, and they only found a few of them, and the rest of the list was dismissed by the Morgenthau Commission. So yes, there was some problems. One time, Polish troops were shot at from some storefront somewhere in, I think it was Brest, and some Jews were beat up and killed in that episode because the troops thought that the shots were coming from the Jewish quarter, where these shops and so on. But by and large, a lot of the allegations against Haller's army were dismissed, but some were not, and he took action. But anyway, he really was not a fan of Józef Pilsudski. And of course, that meant that he was not going to go far in the new Polish army in independent Poland, because he was associated with Roman Dmowski, Pilsudski's arch enemy for many years. So his career slowed down in that sense. He did come to the United States several times to talk to his former troops that he commanded in France and elsewhere. They loved him and welcomed him every time he came here. During World War II, Haller escaped from Poland early in September 1939. He was too old to pick up arms again and fight in that war. But he ended up a circuitous route, but he ended up in London, and with the Polish government in exile, he was given the job of minister without portfolio. So he was there in London, but I don't think at that point he was not relied on for military expertise or anything like that. He was there because Poland was under occupation. It turns out he never went back. In 1945, he left the Polish cabinet once and for all, and he just lived in England until he died in 1960. So that was, and of course, to get back for a moment to Teofil Stasziński, the Pittsburgh doctor that helped out with a lot of this, was instrumental in the Blue Army recruitment. He died in 1952, and he was made by the Polish government in exile a brigadier general, posthumously. So anyway, look, I don't want to talk all day. I just want to tell you that Polish Americans are still proud of what was accomplished to help Poland gain its independence. And the Blue Army is one of those really crucial contributions made by Polish Americans in the period from the World War I period, for sure. Casualties, roughly 2,000 killed in action, and about an equal number, if not more. The statistics are not totally reliable. So about 2,000 killed in action and another couple thousand wounded in action. And from the whole period of time of 1918 to 1921, because they then became part of the regular Polish army when this whole outfit moved to Poland after the World War I ended in 1918 on the Western Front. And then gradually, all these men were discharged and came back to the United States. Many of them had families here, already here. You know, some of them, of course, lied to get into the Holler's Army, and they did have people here that were dependents of these people. But anyway, they established organizations, military organizations for Polish vets who served in Holler's Army, and Holler would come and meet them with them every so often. He was here a number of times after World War I and between World War I and World War II to see his men. So that, in brief, is the story of the Blue Army and Józef Haller and Polonia. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a excuse me. We have a few minutes, so if there are any questions or comments, I'm sure Mr. Szymczak will be glad to entertain them. Yes, sir, in the back.
How did Holler's army get from France to Poland?
On trains. They passed through Germany. It took 6 days.
But
Boxcars.
were the Germans allowing such a thing?
No, the war was over.
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah, but they went by train.
But the trains were working normally.
Yes, not in the sense that you think of a scheduled train.
Right.
They put special trains which went from France through Germany to Poland.
Yep. That's right.
Further questions or comments, please?
Yes.
Ed?
Did the Holler's Army fight in the Battle of Warsaw to defeat Lenin?
They did not. They were, I think, north of Warsaw, contingent of Holler's army. Yes, they did take part in that. Absolutely. But,
Yes, please.
oh,
Hi, can you go into a little more detail on the establishment of distrust between Pilsudski and Haller?
you want to take that?
No, I refuse. He just refuses to answer because obviously he doesn't like to. So,
Well,
would you like to say something?
Yeah. I mean, in Poland, you had Pilsudski, of course, and a lot of people liked him so much that then you have Roman Dmowski. Dmowski was the leader of the National Democrats, National Democratic Party. Pilsudski was, I want to say, an ex-socialist at that time, who was almost, I mean, his personality, it was rather a cult of the personality in some ways. So Dmowski and Pilsudski had a disagreement way back. Dmowski always liked to, he thought that Poland, if it becomes independent, should be close to Russia, because Poland's greatest enemy is the Germans in the western side. So, and Dmowski also was not fond of national minorities in Poland, especially the Jews. He was rather anti-Semitic very often. As a matter of fact, Norman Davies, the renowned historian, said that Roman Dmowski was a professional anti-Semite. Pilsudski was not that. I mean, as a matter of fact, national minorities rather liked Pilsudski and his policies. So they differed on the vision of Poland, what Poland should be. And Haller was not openly political like Dmowski, but he sided with that group. And stuff like that lasts a long time, and it was remembered. So, does that help? Okay.
Yes, please.
Hi. Can you tell us a little bit about the return of the Polish-American soldiers back to the States? How many of them returned? How
Yeah, well, when they came back, and by the way, some stayed in Poland. Those who didn't have a wife or kids here or anything like that, any good ties here, stayed a couple of years, they joined Haller's army, and then ended up going back to their village. Some of them thought they would, because they served in Haller's army, that would give them some sense of, well, they had done something for Poland. And they thought they would be recognized. Some were not. Some were disappointed that they thought they'd be more recognized in certain areas. But no, some stayed in Poland, and then eventually returned to the United States, and some stayed the whole time. But the bulk of his armies came here. They had people here already here, a lot, most of them. You know, brothers, sisters. Yes.
Right. Yes, sir. Right there.
Yes.
Have you ever met him or are you able to meet him?
No.
You never met him.
Halle?
Did he ever come to the United States?
Halle came to the United States a lot of times in the 1920s, even up to the 1930s, to meet with his soldiers who created their own organizations here.
Well, we have his name, of course, in the military post in Britain, which we have also celebrated him during the Little Poland, which I happen to be an ambassador for Little Poland in Britain. And thank you, it was interesting to hear you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir. Right there.
General Howard did visit to Britain in the early 30s, and you had the Howard Post on Grove Street, which was named after him and was very important. Some of those people were actually part of the original Blue Army. I have myself an autograph of General Howard that was given to my father in 34 when he visited here. But he was well known at that time.
Yes, sir.
Professor, were there, if at all, any opinion of the United States government on the conduct of Howard's army, or was it some sort of footnote that, like, the Wilsonian administration's just passed by?
Well, the Wilson administration approved the Morgenthau Commission to go to Poland and to interview people, write a report about atrocities committed against national minorities, especially the Jews. It's called the Morgenthau Commission, and he did issue a report when he came back.
Yes, please, right here.
In the early 1900s, I understand that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a little concerned about the rise of nationalism in Poland, and for that reason, it encouraged nationalism in places like Ukraine and the non-Polish Slavic nations. To the extent that wasn't Poland a little unaware of the rise of nationalism in areas like Ukraine and maybe didn't handle it properly?
Well, when this first started, there was no Polish government to take a look at that. Yes. Well, later, when the borders were settled, the Treaty of Riga in 1921, Poland ends up with a significant portion of minorities in eastern Poland, and they were signatories to the agreement among countries to protect minorities in their countries. But by the 1930s, there's a Ukrainian movement against the Poles, and it got pretty ugly, and the Polish troops had to be sent to Ukraine to pacify certain areas of Ukraine. And that was in the mid-30s, I believe, most of it, yeah, the mid-30s. So, yeah, there were always, so there is this antagonism that's there. So, there was that.
Perhaps a final question. Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, do you know if he was a member of Austrian military or not?
Yes, Haller was an Austrian officer. He went to staff schools and everything else. He left when he was a captain, and but he was trained in Austrian military schools, yes. He was from Galicia.
Yes, now, the lady in the back, please.
One more question. There were a lot of soldiers who returned after the war, 1920, also here in the Holocaust, and many of them, or none of them, received compensation for the war. They came back sick, wounded. So again, the local Polonia organized either help for them with the support of the Catholic Church. Was there any effort on the part of the Polish government or maybe the French government to give some, some financial help? When Haller came, he gave rather moral support to the soldiers.
Right.
He became the godfather of some of the children that were born to the soldiers. We have a great photo in our archives of him being on the altar. So was there any effort of Haller to rouse the financial support for those veterans?
He mentioned it, but nothing will come of it. You see, one of the things that caused bitterness among Haller's veterans after the war was they were not eligible for Polish benefits or American benefits because they served in another army. So no recognition or no benefits came to them from either the Polish government or the United States government with programs for World War I American vets. That didn't happen for them.
And French?
France didn't do much either.
Is there perhaps final question? Yes, sir.
Were there any war medals or decorations, orders, anything like that awarded by the French government?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, they did that. Yeah.
Last question. Yes, sir.
Last question. How did Haller stay alive? Where was his income after he left the Austrian army, between the wars and after the war, after World War II?
Well, he was a Schlachtic. He had some money, and that he never seemed without it. I mean, he wasn't filthy rich, but there was there certainly was an income there.
Well, let's not explore his money.
Yeah.
I was just going to raise a question regarding an earlier question about Pilsudski and Jamalski.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, what's interesting to me is that underneath all the entity of their political affiliations
you take that.
I know, but do you know about that?
Not the details, not the details.
Josh has just invented that because it's a
Yeah.
bad taste. So thank you very
You're
much.
not.
That's the last question. Thank you, Dr. Shimchak.
You're welcome.
Give me your hand. Oh,